start? Alright, okay. Hello everyone, welcome. Selamat siang semuanya. My name is Dia Ayu Kartika. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Political and Social Change here at ANU. Thank you so much for joining us here offline in the men's room, and also those who are attending our discussion online. Hi. So today, before we begin our the presentation today, our session today, I'd like to first acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose traditional lands we meet today, and we pay our respect to the elders past and present. So as you might already know, that we will hear a presentation by Professor Tanya Jakimo on a very interesting topic, a topic that also close to my heart, about gender and politics in Indonesia. And the research, this research actually draws from a very fresh data from the 2024 election, which is really interesting to see what happened specifically in Medan. So the titles of this research is Who Benefits from Gender Electoral Quotas, What Women Bear and Men Gain in Indonesia's Election. So, of course, a lot of you already know about Professor Tanya Jakimo's work, but let me just read her short bio here. So Professor Tanya Jakimo is an anthropologist in the School of Culture, History and Language in the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. Her current Australian Research Council Future Fellowship Project concerns women's political labor and its relationship to the enduring problem of political over or underrepresentation in local government in India, Indonesia, and Australia. So as per usual, we will have 45 minutes of presentation, and then we will be following up by a Q&A session by, about 45 minutes. And for those who are joining us online, you can just put your question on the chat box, and Sarah will help you to put it on the forum later on. So without any further ado, I guess I just give the floor to you, Tanya.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you everybody for coming. It's a real privilege to be able to present here. There are people in the room and online, I'm sure, who have greatly informed my research. And I'm also nervous as hell because I'm really, you know, a little bit conscientious, I guess, or conscious of the fact that I'm maybe not as embedded in the field as some of the strict Indonesianists. I'm across Indonesia and India. And so I guess this is a real opportunity for me to present what we have been thinking around gender electoral quotas, to get your very honest feedback in terms of what you think of the general argument, as well as anywhere that we're going wrong in our argumentation. And if anybody's super, can we have a full draft paper if you really want to be collegial and give us a lot of feedback as well. I am presenting on behalf of the team, Associate Professor Asma Siahan, Ida Harahap, both from USU, and Yumis Delaney from BRIN. Hopefully they are all online. They are the team that we work together, and it's our intellectual labour and our labour in the field. But I do want to say that any mistakes that are in this presentation are really my responsibility because I've had the final draft on it. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about gender electoral quotas in Indonesia. And obviously, probably most of you are aware that in order to address the underrepresentation of women in Indonesia, the government of Indonesia has legislated gender electoral candidate quotas, and the various articles are up there on the screen there. So this started as a fairly soft law in terms of giving consideration to the representation of women, to the zipper quota system, which we're all familiar with, where women have to be in every third position on the ballot paper. And in 2017, this became a law with a little bit of teeth, so that the Electoral Commission can now verify party candidate lists, and they can, if candidate lists that are not compliant can be rejected. Now, we've also can see that there has been an increase in the women in the DPR since the implementation of the quotas, from just under 12% in 2004 up to almost 18% in 2009 election. And then a very kind of slow, gradual, incremental progress up until just over 22% by my reckoning in the latest election. Now, while this is obviously positive, it's moving more or less in the right direction. For many, and I would include myself here, this progress has been relatively slow. It's been incremental, and it hasn't really met the ambitions that people had for the quotas. I'm just going to go very quickly through the reasons why progress has been incremental and the barriers that women face to being elected. Probably most of you are very familiar with this. First of all, there are institutional reasons. So women tend to be positioned in the lowest possible ballot position in order to be compliant with the law. Ella Frihetini has done excellent work looking at where women sit on party lists and also the electability of certain people at different positions. And this is combined with low party magnitude. So in each electoral contest, each party will only get 1 or 2 people elected, and so that with the position on the party list matters. We have open party lists. Now, obviously this is in the open party list means that theoretically you can be elected from any position on the ballot paper, and this theoretical possibility is actually really important for recruiting women, which I'll talk about in a little while. But at the same time, as we all know, this has dramatically increased intra-party competition and the cost of campaigns. And I would say arguably it's the socio-economic barriers that are the greatest barriers for women to win elections, just because campaigns are expensive and women have less access to wealth. In terms of cultural factors, Sally White and colleagues have done excellent work on looking at the beliefs of people in Indonesia around political leadership and finding political patriarchy particularly prevalent. In terms of substantive representation, I think it is worthwhile noting that for the women who are elected, and this is also the case for men, and this is work that Eve has done with her colleagues, they're disproportionately from elite backgrounds. And there's also research that shows with this, with the increase in women's representation, there hasn't actually been a major impact on budget and policy and budget. So quotas have not really transformed the structural conditions that frustrate women's election, and nor are those women being elected in numbers that can make a substantive difference in decision making. Now, in terms of the barriers, we went to Indonesia and we did some preliminary research just after the 2019 elections, and women were so, they thought that the barriers were so insurmountable that they really wondered how they would ever get elected. And so given this context, when we went to 2024, the starting point of our question was actually, why are women bothering to contest at all? Okay. So having done this research, we actually have arrived at maybe a more provocative question. And that is whether not only is Indonesia's quota system fit for purpose, but more critically, can it be doing more harm than good? Now, through the Indonesian case, we also want to make a couple of interventions in the quota literature. So we have developed a paper for a politics and gender journal. So this is where we're kind of wanting to make an intervention, if you like. And we do so in 2 respects. The first is to pay attention to women's lived experiences in terms of how all the women who are incorporated into the electoral system because of quotas, what are the impacts on them, for better or for worse, rather than simply looking at the aggregate impact. So looking at how quotas lead to an increase or a decrease in women's representation. Secondly, and more importantly, we want to suggest a new lens to evaluate quota systems, and that's through attention to the terms of a women's incorporation into electoral systems. And I'll just describe it in a little bit more depth by what we mean here. In terms of by the terms of incorporation, we are looking at what a participant contributes to political systems. So that is the labour they give, their time, their energy, their emotional labour, if you like, against what they receive in return. So whether that's by way of political opportunity, political influence or power, or it could even be, positive experiences. It's a relational concept, so we're also interested in who else is benefiting from their contributions or from their labour. And the lens of adverse incorporation actually comes from development studies, and it questions the fact that inclusion would naturally be a positive thing, and it asks us to look more critically at the terms of their incorporation. So when we're looking at our basic argument is that we need to look at how quotas actually shift or maintain the terms of incorporation for women into electoral politics. So the kind of questions we want to ask is, what additional contributions do they demand of women? How do they shape the return on these investments for women? And how does the labour and investment of participants contribute to other things? So be that to other candidates, to the political parties in general, or even to the electoral system as a whole. So, for example, the legitimacy of our electoral systems. And what we want to argue is that in Indonesia, gender electoral quotas demand significant investments for women without a commensurate return in terms of political opportunity. And this is to the benefit of mostly male candidates and party elites. Now, in terms of the research methods that we did, so the research took place between January and April in 2024. Obviously, I'm sure the election date is seared in everybody's brain as February 14. And we did semi-structured interviews with 24 women candidates. 20 of these women we interviewed once before the election and then once after the election. 2 were just before and 2 were just afterwards. And we also observed as much as possible their campaign activities and took part in these. Now, I want to flag that there are some serious limitations to this research, and that's also another reason to present it to you today. First of all, we only followed women. So I'm going to talk about women's experiences, and I'm going to make some kind of suggestions around what could be gendered impacts, but really we don't have that comparative data with the campaigns or the male candidates. First of all, you probably have noted that the research started in January when the campaign started in November. So we missed those early campaign activities. That was a clash of fieldwork. We also found it really difficult to access so-called tempel candidates. So they're the women who put their name on the ballot paper in name only. So they're not actually seriously contesting. We tried our best, but we couldn't actually access them. And so this has implications I'll talk about a little bit later. And obviously it only took place in Medan. Okay, talking about Medan, so the Regional House of Representatives, just to give you a little bit of background, has 50 legislative seats across 5 dapil, daerah pemilihan, the electoral constituency, I think is how you would say that. And each of those have 8 to 12 members in them. Now, 18 parties across Indonesia can nominate candidates up to 120% of seats. So if a dapil has 10 seats available, each candidate can nominate up to 12 candidates. So what this means is there's a huge amount of candidates, as anybody who follows Indonesian elections knows. So in Kota Medan, there were 830 candidates in 2024. 289 of these, 289, sorry, were women, just a little over 35%. If we put this differently, we can say that 281 women campaigned and lost the elections. And their success rate was slightly lower, just less than 3% compared to just less than 8%. And I've done my maths a couple of times on the success rate. I get this feeling I've got it wrong, but I've done it so many times, but I'm not a political scientist. So anyway, you can see that there has been a slight increase in the number of women elected to the DPRD. From 5 or 10% up to 8 in 2024 or 16%. But the question we want to ask is, what is the cost to women candidates of this marginal increase in female representation? Now we have 3 empirical sections, and I'll just start on the first one. Now, candidate gender quotas work by increasing the demand for women candidates among the selectorate. And the selectorate in this instance means the party elite who are nominating candidates for the election. So in Indonesia, this demand is heightened, of course, by the quotas and the 120% of positions available on the ballot paper, so that if you don't have enough women, then men also cannot contest in that election. And this is something that the women were very aware of. So Ibu Santi says, if we don't come to fill the quota, then the men cannot be candidates. Now, it's not unusual for women to downplay political ambitions, and that's across the, globally, that seems to hold. Nonetheless, we found it quite significant that a lot of the women talked about how they kind of fell into becoming a candidate, that it was only when they were approached by a party that they decided to contest. Emmy says that in the beginning, I had no intention, no desire to contest the election. I was just fulfilling the quota. Now, what's significant is not that they have this, downplaying of their political ambition, but that once they decided or they had fallen into becoming a candidate, they invested heavily in their campaigns. So Anissa had campaigned every day quite heavily in their during the entire campaign period. Well, Ibu Emmy actually negotiated to get number 1 on the party ballot paper, and she had a huge financial cost in her campaign. Now, this demand did increase the bargaining position of women, and some women actually negotiated and shopped around parties in order to get a ballot position or the constituency that they wanted. Other women negotiated to have party support. So if we look at Debbie here, she talks about, she knew that there would be really high campaign costs and that they needed her to contest the elections. And so she said, what support will I get from you? And only when they said that they would give support did she agree to contest the election. Now, without fail, all of the women who spoke like this prior to the election were disappointed with the actual party support that they got, which was next to zero sometimes. Lisa talks about how very few parties kept their promises, and these are false promises. Many candidates are stricken. They say, come on, do the campaigning. Later we will support you. False promises. Wak labu, she said, which literally means Uncle Pumpkin. I don't know if this is broadly outside of Medan, but what it means is a man telling a big story, like saying big things in order to just kind of get somebody to agree to do something, and then these promises are not fulfilled. But I think more important is her comment that many candidates are stricken. And it speaks to how women agreed to contest the election, but knew that they didn't have the personal resources to actually do this themselves, only agreed when the party said it, and then the party kind of left them stricken, if you like. It's also the case that this increased demand did not really result in increased political opportunity or equal opportunity, I would say. And here we can see the position on the ballot paper for all of the 90 seats, 90 number one positions. So if we look at, we have 18 parties contesting each of the 5 dapil. So we have 90 number one positions, of which only 12 women were positioned in number one, 17 at number 2. And while 2/3 of all party lists had women positioned in the lowest possible number, and that is number 3. Now, despite this, we found this really interesting, actually, that the majority of female candidates we spoke with really optimistically about their chances of winning the election. And many of them noted the open party list and said, well, they can, pick anybody on the party list, and so we have as much opportunity as anybody else. And it seemed to be that some of the party recruiters were talking up this possibility while also withholding data as to the poor success rates of positions 3 and below. So the technical possibility of winning encouraged women to invest in their campaigns with arguably little chance of success. Several candidates were also forced to contest in a different dapil from where they had the greatest chance of success, because they were needed to fill gender quotas in another dapil. So Maria started campaigning in dapil 3, where she was born and lived, and she did so 2 months before the start of nomination of candidates. So this is back in September. But at nomination time, the party compelled her to change to a different dapil. And she talks about all of the time and energy that she then had to invest in terms of, getting the trust of the people and getting them to vote for her, if you like, and having to learn from the beginning. And she also talks about how the party had promised her support in this endeavour, but this was just talk. So she was, contesting a different dapil also had, this obviously reduces her electability, and it also increases the investment that she needs to make in their campaign. But it also reduced the intrinsic benefits of campaigning. And this is something we look at down the bottom here. So Wayuni talked about how, people came to her after the election. They knew that she was contesting the election and they wanted to vote for her. She was their friend, she was their family member, but they couldn't find her name on the ballot paper. And Wayuni talked about how she was really sad about this, that she wanted the pride for people to vote for her. Coercion and compulsion was also allegedly used to convince some women to contest. So Lisa talks about how out of all the women, none of us wanted to become a legislative candidate. And then she talks about her friend who she described as being forced or cajoled to contest. So somebody came to her up to 7 times saying, come, contest the election because we need you in order to move forward. And finally, her friend consented and said, but I'm not doing anything. I'm just going to put my name there and fulfill the quota. Now, Lisa's friend became what is known as a tempel candidate. That is somebody who simply stuck or pasted into the ballot paper, but who is not genuinely contesting. Now, as I flagged at the beginning, we were unable to talk to any of these candidates. So I can't talk about their experiences or their motivations to be on the ballot paper. And more importantly, we don't have a sense of what percentage of women candidates are actually just on the ballot paper in name only. But from the perspective of candidates like Lisa, who actually did fight really hard and contested the election very hard, these Temple candidates were a frustration, as in she was left to fight for the party herself. She was the only one in her uphill, only woman to fight for the party. And it also diminished the credibility of all women candidates because, you know, they could just say, well, you're just there to be on the party ballot. So the question that we have really is whether having more women candidates is necessarily a positive in and of itself. And this is sometimes seen as, you know, the mark of what's a success. How many female candidates do we have? I just want to flag that there's some really interesting research that's come out of Poland about the paradoxical nature of candidate quotas within open list electoral systems. So in Poland, prior to the introduction of quotas, there were fewer female candidates on the ballot paper. And so those people who wanted to vote for a woman looked for those women and they were able to get enough elected, if you know what I mean. After quotas, many more women, and so the vote was diluted. Hence the paradox in which there were more women on the ballot paper, but fewer women elected. Now, I don't know whether that's actually happening in Indonesia. I think it's something worthwhile following up on. But I think the broader question as to whether more candidates equals better representational outcomes is something to consider. And hence, I just wanted to flag that I guess we're less concerned, and I'm happy for other people to have different, you know, to share a different opinion on this, in terms of the decision by the General Election Commission to round down the number of female candidates when the number required is a fractional number. Now, we agree that this does reduce the number of female candidates, yet given the at times coercive and misleading tactics to recruit women and the fact that many of the women are only there in name only, we wonder whether this is necessarily a bad thing. Or put differently, what is achieved by requiring more female candidates to contest elections from unwinnable ballot positions? Okay, now I'm going to move on to what women did after they were nominated and became a candidate. Okay, genuinely contesting an election in Indonesia and in Medan as well, it requires considerable investments in terms of time, money, energy, and emotional labour. Now, as mentioned, the campaign period began as early as November 23, and all the candidates that we interviewed had devoted at least a couple of hours every day, up to 6 to 16 hours a day in January when we first met them. Candidates estimated their expenditure as being between 10 million rupiah to typical cost of 100 million rupiah, and some were up to 10 times this amount. Most of the women that we talked to really tried to do their best to reduce campaign costs because they were not well off, but there were some unavoidable expenses such as name cards, snacks, bundle, small gifts, as well as the saksi, the witnesses that they needed, which I'll get to in a moment. But it wasn't really the amount that would make them competitive, I would say. The campaign activities favoured by women were also fairly time-consuming. Although, you know, I want to say that the women were engaged in time-consuming campaign activities, but I remind you, we don't have any data from the men. Nonetheless, the women we follow engaged most in doing door-to-door canvassing, having socialisation events, you know, where people gather in the home of a supporter. They had fun activities like senam, the kind of light aerobics, as well as going to mosques and churches to speak to women there. Now, these efforts not only benefit their own campaign, but also critically contributes to the overall party result. And of course, these are simultaneous elections. So when you're campaigning for the party, you're doing so for your own campaign, but you're also talking about the provincial candidate, and most importantly, the presidential ticket, of course. And women often prioritise talking about the party before they talked about their own campaign. Emphasise the importance here in terms of going, you know, of the women in terms of this particular labour that the women do in order to grow the party, but also to reach out to women's communities, and speaks about the money that she has to spend on these activities as another investment that we have to make. And this was particularly big among the newer parties, so Gelora Party Umat, where they were really concerned about meeting the 4% threshold to hold seats, And so they were doing a huge amount of socialisation to raise the party, and this was, whether they like it or not, also going into their personal campaigning. I'll just very briefly talk about the tandem arrangements because, of course, this is one way that could arguably reduce the cost of campaigns, but it actually becomes more indicative of the kind of exploitative conditions in which women do become candidates. So for those of you who don't know, tandem arrangements are when you combine with somebody contesting in a different electoral contest, but from the same party, and you split costs and you turn up to each other's socialisation events. What we found is that when women tried to negotiate better terms for this, or what they found was that the terms of these tandem arrangements didn't really recognise the enormous amount of labour that they were doing on the ground. So Hurti talks about how she tried to negotiate so that, she was bringing her support base, all the labour that she was doing in the field, getting the grassroots activities. And so she wanted to negotiate not having a 50-50 split in costs. Because her energy can't be divided in two. The terms of this agreement, the terms were not accepted by the other candidate, and so she didn't have a tandem arrangement. There were only a couple of women that we spoke to who did enter tandem arrangements, and both of them had negative experiences in terms of people not actually, their partner not turning up to their socialisation activities. But we have small sample numbers, so yeah. And Elizabeth, who was a re-elected incumbent, said that she doesn't enter tandem arrangements just in general because, if we thought about it as we were workers, we would be a loss in these types of arrangements. They're a bit exploitative. The exploitation most directly felt by the vast majority of female candidates actually came, though, right at the end of the election at the time of counting votes. Now, according to our interpretation of Indonesian law, votes are counted directly according to the number received by each candidate. And as far as we're aware, there's no provision to allow parties to transfer votes within the same party. Yet it is very common practice for votes to be redistributed from a candidate with a lower vote count to a fellow party member in order to bolster their vote count so that they can be elected. I think we're all pretty familiar with these practices. In some cases, in some parties, it seems to be fairly formalised so that there's money can exchange hands in terms of a set payment for each vote. And I should also say that a lot of women were pretty happy to give their votes to the party because they wanted to build the party. That was, they were happy with that. Yeah, most of the women, when we talked to them after the election, they were really angry about this. They had lost a lot of their votes, and they alleged that their votes had been stolen without permission or that they had otherwise been compelled or pressured to give them up. So we can see here that Farah talks about how she had 1,500 votes and became only 500 votes, and these were taken from within the political party itself. Debbie talks about how not only did her votes go down, but she also talks about how this was like a lack of validation, if you like, or, it felt that, she had done all this effort to get all of these votes. This was a pure testament of all the great positive sentiment she had in the community, and then it was stolen from her, and she felt that, having this lower vote count meant that her efforts were not appreciated. So what we want to suggest in this section of the paper is that women's time, energy, emotions, and money are given willingly, compelled, or appropriated without permission to the benefit of party elites and successful candidates, the majority of whom are men. Which leads us to our final empirical section, which is looking at who actually benefits from candidate quotas. So interviews following elections when the majority of your candidates have lost are really tough. I don't know how many people have done these. I'm sure many in this room. Anyway, as you can see on the screen, only 2 of the women that we interviewed prior to the election were successful in their campaign. I should reiterate, you can also see that most of them got relatively small vote counts. And I want to reiterate that with the exception of 2 candidates, all the women we interviewed expected to at least have a good showing. And some were, they would express confidence that they would win, but even if they didn't think they would win, they thought that they would, it was a possibility. They dealt with disappointment in very different ways, and this came out in the interviews, and you can see in the words of some of the respondents. So it was deeply disappointing because I had given everything, exhausted my time, my efforts, my physical strength, but this was in vain. Wiyanti talks about how I gave everything, spent everything financially, materially, but in the end, it's like that. Now, by pointing to the experiences of women who lost, I don't want to overlook the fact that men also probably have these experiences. And this is certainly something we see in the media reports and the rumours that circulate post-elections, the very sad attempts at suicide and withdrawing from society and ending up in hospital and all the rest of it. I guess we're just drawing attention to the women here, and I guess what would be distinct in terms of women's experiences is due to the terms of their recruitment into the entire process at the beginning, as well as their lower chances of success. Given the poor outcomes for candidates, we did ask them whether any regretted contesting the election, and not a single one of them said that they regretted the decision. Indeed, many said that they benefited, and these benefits included, getting a sense of politics and thinking about politics, continuing in politics, the feeling of happiness that came from the experiences that they had, getting to know people, from the bottom to the top, this inner satisfaction that they felt, as well as thinking about how the experiences had helped them develop their own self-confidence or other skills as well. So these mostly intrinsic benefits of quotas, of the positive impact of quotas, should not be understated. And I think particularly in a context where sometimes women have fewer opportunities to actually engage in this public service, social, community-oriented work or in public acts of piety. Women candidates also felt that the quotas were important as one strategy to increase women's representation. And when we asked them this, it was for very similar reasons to what we hear throughout. So on justice grounds, women are 50% of their population. Women understand women's needs. They give different, characteristics to decision-making and so on. Yet most felt that the quotas were not having the desired impact, as they still had to compete with men in an electoral system in which they feel they face considerable disadvantage. So Lila was among several women who said that in the guerrilla warfare of Indonesia's elections, women are at a disadvantage, and it was in part due to their feminine characteristics that they felt that they couldn't compete on equal grounds as men. And part of the problem, of course, is the lack of commitment from the parties to give them, a good position on the ballot paper, and that could make a difference. Hafifa actually won her election, and she talked about how many of the women didn't campaign to their full extent. They see themselves as just being pelangkap or supplement, and the men also can see women in that way, and so that was also needed to be addressed. We also asked each of the women who benefited the most from quotas. And most talked about how, the majority said that the party was who benefited most from their campaigns, and thereby the candidates that encouraged or compelled them to contest. So Elfina talks about how if we are not elected, our votes go to the party, so it benefits from quotas too. Who is this? Najwa talks about how in the socialisation, we do all this socialisation and the voters will forget the name of the person doing the socialisation, but they'll remember the party. So they'll just punch the ballot paper for the party. So it's the party who benefits most from her campaign. So Ibu Khurti, she talks about how quotas benefit the party because the leaders still, because they're elected with their votes. If she's fortunate, she will be elected. But if she doesn't get elected, there is no benefit for the woman. It is just for the benefit of the party. Parties also benefit from the increase in candidates who are able to bolster their overall vote counts. But I also just want to draw quickly attention to the forms of feminised labour that women do, reaching women women voters. And this is something that some of the women also talked about how they were encouraging more women to enter politics, and this was helping political parties grow, and that people preferred coming to female candidates. And Dalia talks about how that it is the party that benefits, and that the women are only there to get the votes of the women, as it is otherwise hard to reach them. So it's the party that's profiting from their campaigns. The women only do a little community service. So Indonesia in this way has interesting parallels to India. So as Rena Williams and my own research shows, the incorporation of women, including through gender electoral quotas at the local level in India, has been absolutely critical to the rise of the BJP, which is the dominant party in India and the world's biggest political party. Now, the political outcomes are obviously very different in Indonesia's fragmented party system, yet the core dynamic is the same, that women's incorporation into party politics is on unequal terms. And the fruit of their labour is appropriated by parties and other candidates that are most often male. So Indonesia's candidate quotas insist upon women's participation without helping them to challenge the terms of their incorporation. And this leads to parties benefiting as much or more from women's candidacy than the women themselves. So becoming a candidate due to gender quotas does not bestow benefits on women or significant benefits on women. At the same time as extracting significant costs, can the large increase in female candidacy be considered a positive outcome? Or in other words, what is the cost of marginal increases in female representation due to quotas, and who bears these costs? Now, what we want to argue is that the terms of women's incorporation have been inequitable. So we feel that they are in some ways exploitative and they don't get the returns that they invest in political campaigns. But we are not suggesting that they are adverse, that they have a detrimental impact. And so we are definitely not suggesting that we get rid of gender quotas. We feel that these are still important. However, at the same time, I think that expecting quotas to have this gradual increase in women's representation and then at some point it will lead to improvements in gender equality, and this is an argument we heard in a seminar just over a year ago, respectively, we believe that this might be a naive position and maybe even a dangerous position because it doesn't allow further action. Rather, we need to change the terms of women's incorporation so that their investments are reduced and their access to political opportunity is increased. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. I mean, maybe revert to closed party lists with legislation for women to be in winnable positions, campaign financing so that they are not having to dip into their own finances so much. A lot of the women suggested that a number of seats could be in each multi-member district could be reserved for women as an alternative. And other women suggested that women should just require a lower threshold of votes as men because they face disadvantages. Obviously, these all require kind of consideration, but that's where we think it could go. Just to reiterate, I guess to end on where we feel our intervention is, and that's into the scholarship on gender electoral quotas, which is a really big and congested body of literature. But we still think that there is room to improve our understanding by paying attention to the experiences of all women, including women who are candidates and not elected, rather than just looking at aggregate impacts, as well as examining how quotas influence women's terms of incorporation into electoral politics. What does it demand of them? What do they do? Who do these actions benefit? And what do they get in return? We have some future papers that we're planning, but I'm really out of steam and you probably are listening to me too. But they also qualify some of our, some of the statements that we make. They kind of soften them. But anyway, we can get to that later if you like. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you very much for coming and I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for your presentation, which is really interesting. Maybe we just start with our first round of questions. So we will collect 3 questions, so Marcus, Sarah, and then we will move to the online audiences. Marcus first?
Yeah, thanks. That was great. I guess in terms of the exploitation of women by male candidates, your strongest claim is that votes are actually stolen. So not only through indirect mechanisms where people vote for the party, then the vote is transferred to the party itself, and then they are being redistributed to men, but actually, theft of votes. And as you indicate, we hear this quite a bit. But it would be great if in your work you could actually document how that works in detail, and that you can really have a strong foundation for that claim. I always personally wondered how the mechanics of that happens, at what level of the KPU counting and so forth, if this transfer of votes happens. If you were gasping.
No. I mean, where some people have written on this. There are.
Yeah, but in this case particular, for men stealing the votes of women, to make that case separately, so that it doesn't stand there as a claim. Because again, a lot of losing candidates, I've heard this from almost all losing candidates, somebody else stole my votes. Right? And so in this case, have you gotten any of that evidence and documentation, and will it flow into your work?
No, we don't have any evidence from that part of what happened in the Kabehu when it was the votes were counted. So we've only got what happens with what the women told us themselves. And I take a point, like this is something we've also examining in a number of other elections in India and in Australia as well, is these narratives of loss and how they can, I guess, how people make sense of a loss which is so big that they need to find other explanations for it. Now, this obviously, I can't remember if I don't think it's one of the papers from Indonesia that we're looking at, but this is one of the papers that we're developing, and it's another way where I said, where we want to investigate this more, qualify some of our earlier, the strength of our argument, I guess. I guess I would also say, what was I going to say? Yeah, I mean, I still find it interesting that is the way that they feel that they have experienced the election. And I think that there's also a really interesting temporality to when they were most likely to express this anger, whether this is anger at the party for just exploiting them during the campaign period, or whether it's in relation to the votes. And it usually came just at the moment where things were most fresh, right? So the candidates that we were able to access or talk to really quickly after the election or after the vote were pretty much settled, they were the ones who were most raw. And then after time, we got more it's a positive experience. And, so this also needs to come into our analysis. But thank you, Marcus. I agree. That's I would love to hear about people who've done this research so that we can incorporate it in.
All right. Next question, Sarah.
Thank you, Tanya. Really interesting. So you mentioned the experiences of losing candidates. I'm just curious. What about the winning women candidates? How did they manage to win?
How did they manage to win? Yeah, so I mean, out of the candidates that we only followed two that won, and then a further one we talked to after the election, but she was an incumbent, so she had very different, and she was also, her family was in politics, and it's that kind of candidate. For the ones who won, they had one of them was a PKS candidate, and so she had a huge amount of women working for her in order to get elected, and also men. So I would say that it was the sheer force of the volunteers that she was able to mobilise, as well as all of the events that she was able to hold as well. And also they were positioned at number one on the ballot paper, which of course helped an enormous deal as well. Yeah, that's a very brief response, but that's pretty much it.
All right, next one.
Thanks. Thanks, Tanya. That was really great. And yeah, I'm trying to get my head around the sort of very provocative sort of core argument you've got there. Just maybe a couple of comments or questions. I mean, one is on the list position thing, which occupies a big role in your argument. And I guess the only thing I would say there, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense that this high list position confers an argument, but I think that's often assumed unproblematically in the literature on Indonesian politics, because the other side of the coin is that it's the strong candidates who get the high list position. So is the high list position a cause of these people getting elected, or is it the product of them being strong candidates?
Yeah.
And women candidates tend to be weaker in terms of name recognition, money, networks, etc. So, there's a bit of an issue there, I think, or at least slightly problematic. The second issue, I guess, is I might not articulate this well. So I sort of understand about how losing candidates feel that their votes, the votes they earn and the kind of energy they put into the candidate contribute to their party doing well, or male candidates benefiting. And you're right that the narratives you're sort of giving here are very, very similar to what losing male candidates would provide. But I guess the point is, when you look beyond the place of individual candidates, the same things are happening in the other parties, right? So the boost that those losing women candidates are giving male candidates in one party are getting cancelled out by what's going on in the other party. So isn't it true that if you want to see who benefits as a class or as a group from quotas, the only way to do that is by looking at the aggregate, right? The aggregate numbers, and isn't it then kind of, it is actually women. I mean, because over time, if we assume that the quota has been the main driver of this decline or this rise of winning female candidates, then 10% of male candidates have been losers. So I guess I'm trying to get my head around that sort of perspective which you're giving of the viewpoints of these women candidates who lose and feel they're contributing a great deal, and then trying to connect that to the aggregate picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if you... Yeah.
No, they're two great provocations and both very important. What I would say in terms of the position on the ballot paper, this is something that I should definitely flag, that it is the stronger candidates who get the number one position, or in some cases we heard people buying the number one position. And so, whether or not they're getting elected because they are number one or because they are the stronger candidate, I think I couldn't answer that definitively. What I would say is that gender electoral quotas are in some ways trying to overcome the disadvantages that women have in that. So yes, men have more name recognition. That's part of the gendered barriers that women face. And so that would be probably how I would respond to that that critique, I think. In terms of the class and thinking about who as a class wins and looking at that in aggregate, what I would say to this is, I guess, I think that holds when winning is the ultimate endpoint. And I'm not saying that the women weren't in it to win, but I would also think that there should be other... I think where the women felt left down was not because they didn't win, right? They got 200 votes, 500 votes, they weren't going to win. But it's that they felt that all of the effort that they had given had, just been taken from them. So I think that, and it definitely requires a nuance of the argument. Yeah, especially because I say all throughout this it benefits male candidates. It's probably a little bit strong now that I think about it. So thank you very much. But I think that's where the problem lies for me in terms of the quota system, especially when they were kind of, encouraged to step forward. Yeah. I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
All right. So we already have 2 questions here online, and then one from Eve. Then the rest we will take for the third round.
So yeah, we currently have 28 participants join online, and the first question is from Najib. Does a simultaneous election system in which voters cast 5 ballots for presidential and parliamentary candidates at the same time make it more difficult for female candidates to get elected?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think there was a article in your special issue that looked at this quantitatively, right? In terms of what impact simultaneous elections have. I don't have any quantitative data on this, so I'm not going to say yes or no. But what I would say is that my impression is that it does disadvantage women, because so much of the emphasis in the field and in the election is on the presidential campaign, and there's so much more additional work that seems to be having to be done in order to bolster the candidate as a whole. So, I think it is harder for women to, and probably men, and to cut through the noise of so many different campaigns and to have people hold on to their name when they go into the ballot paper, into vote. Does that advantage men more than women? Maybe, because men are more likely to have name recognition prior. But yeah, I do think that, that's my impression. As I say, it's not quantitative, and I wouldn't be not strong on that.
And the next question is from Gita Putri Damayana. Tanya, thank you for your presentations. Apologies if I understood your presentations incorrectly, but the recommendations is to have closed proportional system because it is better for women candidates. Can you elaborate more on this specific point?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, this isn't probably, you know, one of the we don't write any recommendations. This is just, I guess, thinking through how we could reform the quota system. I don't know if other people in this room agree, but I think potentially having closed party lists would reduce the intra-party competition and therefore reduce the amount of money that is required to win. So from that perspective, I think that would be beneficial for women. And that's why I would leave it to the experts, but I would probably advocate it in that respect. But then it would also require, because of the low party magnitude, it would require women to be higher up the ballot paper as well. So yes, I think did I answer that question entirely?
Well, let's leave it to Kira or somebody to comment more.
Okay, yes. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. These are fantastic questions. Thank you so much.
All right, Eve.
Thanks, Kay. That was excellent. So interesting. I guess my comments sort of relate to Ed's. I just sort of feel that, you know, your kind of explanations or in your characterization of sort of the grievances of the women who lost at the moment still sounded so similar to the grievances that we hear in general. You know, that my votes were stolen, I was lower down the list, that person was so rich they kind of, you know, either bought my votes or just they're hard to compete with. And like I said, you know, women tend to be lower down because they don't have the finances and the networks. And so I was just wondering, with your would be really, I think, you know, it's perhaps a more powerful sort of narrative if in your interview data you have women sort of talking about those sorts of the barriers that they experience as women, being able to access things like, you know, networks of wealthy business people, or they have trouble going to sort of particular types of events that might connect them into those sorts of networks that are so critical for, you know, running a well-resourced campaign. Like they don't get to go perhaps to sort of, I don't know, the hit me events, like the, you know, or they don't sort of get connected into other sorts of social networks that men do. And maybe the women that did win, okay, they obviously had huge resources. You know, the next, like the obvious question is, are they someone's wife? Are they someone's sister? You know, how is it that they are, or are they kind of their own women of particular women's networks that are extremely important to them? So I sort of feel like in your data, that story of kind of what is it about being a woman that might make the kind of the finance and the networking story very, very different to sort of, you know, male candidates. The other comment I had was, you know, this question of like who benefits. Okay, so, you know, Ed's comment I totally agree with, but I think when I think about, you know, okay, so once these women are in the DPRD or the DPR, who benefits then? I don't think the data you have, so this is because your story is all about campaigning, so like the party benefits because they get these women's votes even if they don't win, or the male candidate votes, you know, wins, but benefits, sorry. But then, like, I guess the other big kind of, what people often say anecdotally is that, you know, women are in there as proxies. So if they're on a polling cup, they might be a proxy of some sort because they're someone's wife or someone's family. They're in there to represent someone else's business interests. And so I think that, I mean, maybe you don't have that data yet, but it's sort of an interesting question as well, because we think of like increasingly DPR guys and DPRD people, they're in there for their own business interests. Some of them, a lot of them benefit personally, financially from being, they get rich from being in the DPR. Yeah. But for women, is it exactly the same? Or are they there, are they sort of, is it, you know, are they doing the labor of others when they're in the DPR, the self-interest of others, I guess. Sorry, that's a little bit, you know, rambling a bit, but you see what I mean. It's the next part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And two great questions again. So I think what's, you know, different in terms of women, and I take your point, and I think that would be, you know, if we were looking at the research project in terms of how women, you know, won, if that was the focus rather than why they contest and how they come to contesting. So I think for me, the difference, you know, what is it that's particular to women? It's all of those things that you mentioned, but, you know, and we have, you know, the data in terms of the challenges that they faced. But I think for me, the more important point is the way that they become a candidate. You know, I think that's important. Like, I think it's important the way that they're sort of, you know, sometimes, you know, coerced and they're, you know, cajoled and they're talked to many, many times. So that these women who are reluctant then decide, oh, look, I can campaign. And then, you know, maybe I can even win because that's what they're being told. So these, you know, I don't want to use this word because it sounds a bit patronizing, but you know, a lot of them are pretty naive, you know, like they haven't built networks over years because they didn't think that they would run a campaign, right? And so they've just kind of fallen into it, like they say, and then they've invested all of this time, and then they've come out of it going, well, was that good or bad? I don't know. So I think that's where it differs, but I think that's really important research. But I guess we were less focused on those women who had a good chance of winning, and looking at, you know, the other 281 candidates who devoted time to it, even if it was just putting their name there. In terms of the proxy, you know, and the proxies in the DPRD or whatever, I think that's I mean, this is not something that we did research a couple of years ago that did look at women's experiences as elected representatives. But I think actually, you know, it's, you know, because I do look at the labour of women who are elected, including in proxy roles, but it's much more in India, if I'm honest. And so there, I mean, there's a lot of women who are elected on behalf of men or on behalf of husbands or fathers, etc. And there they do a lot of work that is completely invisible because they are just seen as proxies. And in fact, that's part of the arguments there, is that this label of proxy means that it diminishes the work or you know, the contributions of women as a block sometimes. You know, it's very easy to say, oh, like they're proxy for somebody else.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so let's open our third round. So Sana, Sally, and okay.
Thanks, Tanya. So this is fascinating. I have a question for you about what I see as a disconnect between what you're claiming and what your evidence is actually saying.
Okay,
right?
great.
So your evidence is really about self-described experience of women.
Yeah.
It's about their perception of what has happened to them. And that's very clearly describing a situation where these women are, you know, cognitive dissonance or trying to make sense of their loss, or they definitely see that they are putting in labor more than men and getting less than men, in fact, having their votes stolen by men, right? But that's not fact. But your argument, the way that you're presenting it, suggests that this is factual, that women are producing this labor and then they're getting, you know, ditched in the end, right? So why isn't this paper more about self-perception of women candidates and less? Because if you were to make this case factually, you would need what Ed's saying, what Marcus is saying about, you know, okay, well, do candidate number 3 who are men also have their votes stolen in the same way? Doesn't that, you know, happen to everybody who's in a number 3 position, and women are more likely to be there? Does this happen more to, you know, for example, men who are naive politically, who don't have those kinds of connections, right? So you would need sort of relational data to make that relational point. But if you are focusing on the perceptions that you're describing, that's still a powerful paper. I'm just wondering, you know, if you are sort of presenting it as fact, but actually it's just self-described experiences.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid criticism. And I, you know, this is something that, yeah, when I mentioned at the beginning in terms of the qualifications, you know, we don't have data from men. So this is all from the perspective of women. Yeah, and I take that point, and I think maybe it's about how I present it, because for me, the broader argument is in relation to how we look at gender electoral quotas. So for me, it's a theoretical kind of intervention in that respect, rather than purely a factual paper. But obviously, you know, that, yeah, no, I mean, I think I need to think about this in terms of the way that I present the data. And I do agree, you know, there are lots of unknowns that we don't know, and it is the perspectives of them. So, yeah, but I still hold that broader point that when we're looking at quotas, we need to be looking at the ways that, you know, the relation between, you know, what people are doing and how that might be gendered. I think it's how it's gendered, which we've struggled with, which is, you know, what I flagged at the beginning. Yeah, but thanks, Emma.
All right, so thanks so much, Tanya. That was fascinating and lots of great material to follow up on and really rich empirical data. I guess one point I think is worth making is that the particular DPRD that you have chosen has quite low women's representation, right? 16%. And I wonder if you were doing the same study in North Sulawesi, for example, you know, we've got DPRDs that are almost 50%. Like we've just got this enormous variation in terms of women's representation. And at different levels, the DPRD lower level is the worst, like that's the lowest representation. And, you know, Kota Medan actually is slightly above the average, but it's just so low. So I guess what would it look like, for example, if you did the same study in North Sulawesi, where larger amounts of women are winning, the narratives would be quite different. So I guess just a word of caution about how much you can extrapolate, because there are clearly areas of Indonesia where women are benefiting a lot more from the quota, and other areas where it just seems to be having very little impact at all, which is a fascinating thing in itself.
Yeah,
so
it is.
How does your sort of research contribute to looking more at the variation?
I wish I did look at the variation, but again, this was, you know, one way that it's, you know, qualified that we did only look at Medan, and you know, I don't have that comparative data, and I don't have the capacity to get that comparative data now. But you know, I think, I would love to know, and I guess this is also about the qualifying the paper in itself, in thinking about, you know, when we have the suggestions for reform or what have you, thinking very carefully about, you know, how applicable is this beyond the very small case study that we have. And so I really appreciate that comment in terms of the caution that we have to bring into anything we say. Not a great response, but hopefully other people are doing this research so I can compare across.
All right.
I just wanted to ask, of the 22 women that you interviewed, Tanya, and you made reference to the issue of elite origins of many successful candidates. From those 22 that you interviewed, how much of a sense did you get of what their position was in society socioeconomically? How many of them did in fact come from very well connected or elite backgrounds? And particularly what kind of leverage this gives them. So this issue that, okay, they might be pressed by the party leadership, the local party leadership to run, and they want to make sure the party's going to support that. So if you come from an elite background, presumably you would have a lot more leverage to extract resources from the party than what you might have if you're just a hard-working but not particularly well-connected party leadership. So I wonder if your research on Medan gives any kind of insights into how important elite placement was.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Greg. A really great question, which I don't think we have great data on because our sample is quite small. Out of the 24 women that we interviewed, only one of the women that we interviewed after the election, because she had been elected, had a very strong, you know, family connection. So, you know, her parents had been elected, and, you know, she was very well connected in that respect, and she had a very well-resourced campaign. There were, out of the others, there was only a couple who, I wouldn't say that they were well connected in terms of, you know, any dynastic kind of political dynasties or what have you, but what they had is they had a husband who was well placed within the party. So that helped them to both get a position that was profitable, so number one or number two, and also allowed them to get those resources as well. The majority of the women that we spoke to didn't have anybody in their immediate family who had a huge amount of those connections. But some of them, you know, their husband was also in the party or what have you. And you know, it was because the husband talked to them, you know, that she was convinced to become a candidate. But again, I would say, you know, in terms of their social position, then most of them were kind of lower middle class. They were fairly modest, from fairly modest backgrounds. Yeah.
All right. So we have 2 online questions. So I'll just grab one from this forum. Anyone want to ask? Any other person? So I'll just give it to Josh first, and then going back to you again. So 2 questions over.
Actually, the first question is quite the same with Greg's valid questions, but the follow-up question is how would you think it will be fixed in the next elections? for that, like how to prioritize their candidates based on the background?
I don't really have any great insights into that, if I'm honest. Like in terms of, so the question is, what should we do in relation to the next election? Yeah, I mean, So yeah. I don't know. I mean, getting parties to commit to actually giving the support that they promise, getting them to commit potentially to putting them up on party lists, but you know whether that would actually be a thing. Yeah, I mean, this is a. I mean, there are things that. Okay, let me start again because I do think that there is a response to have to this question. I think we need to start a bit earlier in terms of identifying people, women in particular, who could be credible candidates, who getting them to start early, thinking about their networks, thinking about how they connect across to people, how they build that constituency around them. You know, 1 or 2 years prior to the election, if not beforehand, getting people who are not just like tapped on the shoulder at the last minute, but having a much longer term engagement with women so that when they are selected, they have that opportunity to build their campaigns as well as they're more likely to want to campaign. Yeah.
The second question is from Mudi Rahmatunisa. Are the interviewees the party's female cadres? Not all those nominated are female cadres who have been members for a long time. The party openly accepts candidates from outside who have more resources. So it is female cadres who are already members. What about in your research?
Yeah, so I would say only 50% of the women we spoke to with cutters before standing for the election, they were, you know, wives or what have you of other people. So yeah, but the question is in relation to people coming in with a lot of money and then they are nominated as candidates rather than those cutters who are putting in a lot of the work prior to the election. Is that the question? Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, no, I mean, because we saw it from the other side, we didn't speak to any of the cutters who didn't contest in the election, except for when we, you know, came across them in socialization events and all the rest of it. So I don't think they were, you know, they weren't, you know, upset about that process. That is something that I see a lot in India, though. You know, women who've been working very hard for the party over decades and then they're overlooked for the party ticket. But there it's only one party ticket per seat. So it's a very different kind of dynamic.
So obviously, like one of the interesting things about Medan is the degree of religious diversity.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, did religion make a difference in the experience of the candidates and the strategy?
Yeah, no, really great question. Yeah, I think it did. One of the papers that we want to develop is looking at how politics can be an avenue to engage in public acts of piety, and lots of women, you know, become candidates because they want to work for a party, be it PKS or Party Umat, who, you know, they see it as a form of religious service, if you like. And that was the same, and the language that they used was very similar to what a lot of Christian Batak people said as well. You know, that they would say that they're doing this because they want to, you know, that it's, you know, ethical, moral reasons for wanting to contest, and that they could, you know, be in service to the community through this as well. So I wouldn't say, you know, yeah, I think it does have a difference, but what I find more interesting is the similarities across Christian and Muslim candidates. Yeah, especially because so much of the emphasis is on, you know, Muslim candidates and why they run and piety amongst women. So yeah, I thought that was interesting, and that's why Medan is kind of interesting. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Any other properties, and very any other?
Boleh lah.
All right. Okay. Fine. I'll hold it back. Okay.
Kathy's protecting me. She's like seeing me flag. One question time.
All right. Property person.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. So based on your presentation, my impression is there is an issue on women preference and norm. So then, so the story that I actually learned is that this quota actually shape those norms in a way, inside that some of them are actually willing to be a candidate. So what is it? The impact is actually more pool of women that are actually having some preference that are actually becoming candidates. So, and the way that we need to look at the benefit or not of this quota is in the long term, because this pool could be bigger, bigger, bigger. And then with a bigger pool, the strategy will be involved, they will be thinking what others do. And so long term is what actually we could tell whether this strategy is correct or not. Because again, the big issue to me is this preference and all.
Right, thank you so much. I really valid comments, especially when, you know, many of the women talked about how, you know, this was the start of their, you know, continuation in politics. And so one could imagine that they, you know, having dusted themselves off from this election, they could be, you know, contesting further elections as well. And I do think that it would have a soft kind of influence in terms of the women who are willing to become candidates. But I'm cautious for two reasons. The first is that, as we have seen from the charts, the rate of progress is very slow. So if it is having a big impact on increasing the supply of women who want to become candidates, then it seems to be working very slow, a little bit slower than I would want it, or that is suggestive of there will be progress in the future. And the second reason is that, and I think Ella Prihatini's has done some research on this, where, you know, how difficult it is for parties to recruit women who have been burnt in an election. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, she might even be online to correct me, but I think just before the 2024 election or the 2019 election, she went and spoke to party recruiters, and they said that there are so many people, so many women who, they can't convince women to contest because they have gone through an unsuccessful election. So although, you know, I think, yeah, in an ideal world that might possibly happen, but yeah, I don't think we should put all our hopes into that. Yeah.
Yes, Dan, thank you very much for your very provocative presentation of that material. Because when I read your synopsis, it read to me like this was advocacy for doing away with quotas. Quotas do more damage than they do good. Now, having heard your presentation, so you're not arguing that, which I'm glad to see, because it seems to me that, well, I'm just wondering if I could suggest that in presentation of the issue of the quota, it's not an issue of having quotas or not having quotas, but rather, as the literature shows, it's a question of the design of quotas. That's really the critical thing. How is the quotas designed? What are the features, the elements of it? And the quota that Indonesia is currently working with is a fairly low quality one, mainly because it doesn't have what the literature says is so critically important, which is placement mandates. In other words, it's possible to get away with it by putting women on 3 or 4 below. And the point that I made in my paper is not that just having a quota will by itself produce the results, but rather the debate should be more about not if quotas are good or not good, but how can they actually be improved. So if it seems to me that the paper, rather than just sort of mentioning a few possible things that could be done, as you do, rather emphasise the critical importance of possibly what will be incremental changes, but gradual changes to improve the design of quotas in Indonesia.
Yeah, I think we're in probably furious agreement about the need to keep the quota but also to reform it. And I did, you know, maybe it's a bit cheeky to have such a provocative title as well as an abstract, but, you know, we really did want to, I guess, you know, there can be an assumption that every gender electoral quota will have positive impacts overall. And I think that we do need to question that assumption, and hence why the paper was kind of framed in the way that it is. The broader paper is not so, I guess, provocative. Yeah, in terms of the, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second bit. Let me just regroup. Not if, but how. Yeah, no, I mean, for us, I think what you know, what the important point is that when we are looking at reforms and we are thinking about how Indonesian quota systems could be reformed better, then we need to also think about the terms of women's incorporation into these political systems. And that was kind of where I was trying to get at in terms of the presentation of empirical material. I keep losing this thought. It keeps going and going. That's so frustrating. But the other thing that I would say is that, you know, if we are, like, how do we make the case that they need to be reformed is the other thing. So, you know, we can make the case by saying, you know, progress is too slow, and then we'll get, well, you know, it's slow, but it is progress, so let's keep going on. Or we can say, look, these are not actually good for women at the moment, you know, that they're having some detrimental impacts, that it's not necessarily good to just increase the number of women candidates, to say it as a kind of a stronger argument for reform, rather than, well, hopefully everything will work out. Yeah. But thank you. That's great question. Oh, great provocation.
All right. Fine.
Thanks. Yeah, this was just a comment. So in response to some of the other commentary before about people saying, well, these are similar to the experiences of losing male candidates. You said something about how the experience of women being recruited as candidates is really distinctive, and I just wanted to make the observation that I think that's really true, that in order, I mean, certainly in my experience of interviewing male candidates, you very, very, very rarely, almost never find male candidates who say, oh yeah, I had to be approached, I had to be persuaded. There are naive male candidates, but they tend to be naive in the sort of overconfident sort of direction. Like, I've got a lot of friends here, so of course I'm going to win, you know, that sort of thing. Or if there's a persuasion story, it's more about, you know, well, I'm such a tokoh masyarakat here that everyone wanted me to stand and I couldn't say no, that sort of it. I think you're totally right there, that there is something very distinctive about that sort of, you know, that entry story into politics, that's really worth emphasising. Yeah. So certainly it matches my experience.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. Yeah, to be honest, when you started, I was like, oh no, this is another way where it's just going to be exactly the same for men and women. So it is heartening. Well, it's not heartening, but it's good to know that, you know, that what we thought was a gendered part of the process is actually in some way distinct for women. Our problem is that we don't have the evidence for it. So, but it is, you know, it's good to know that is, that your experience. So thank you very much for sharing that.
All right. Okay, let's open the round. So, Sana, any other? Fina, any other? Yeah. Okay, I've got one. Yeah. Okay.
Just a quick question. Did you ever have a case where two women were running on the same list?
On the same party list?
Yeah.
Yeah, so of course, so if there's, you know, 12 people in the party list, so then they would have to have 4 women.
4 women. And did you have one of those cases where there were 12 nominations and there were more women? What was the difference, I guess, between experiences of the women who were running on the same party's list but at different positions? Was that something you were...
Oh, so do you mean that within our sample, did we have people who were running in the same dapil on the same party list and...
Against each other.
Against each other, yes. We did have one example of this. And if I'm not, I remember one of them was at the very top of the list, I mean at the very bottom, so she was number 12. And so she thought that actually gave her an advantage because people could find her. And then her running mate, I think, was number 5 or 6 from memory. I can't entirely remember. But we met them together and they were certainly not competing. I mean, I think they got a lot of you know, value from being able to share the experience. And it's contrasted with Lisa, who was complaining about how all the people in her dapil, all the women, were not contesting. And so she felt that she was having to do all the work for the party for themselves. So I would suggest that if they have somebody on their party list who they're friends with, it would make it a more positive experience. I mean, that's a sample of, you know, 1 and 1. So I mean, I'm not drawing any conclusions, but is that kind of what you're asking? Great, thanks, Anna.
All right. My question is how is the difference in countries in the candidate have the political dynasty related and the one that's not in the like party and in competition?
Yeah, I mean, we only really spoke to one candidate who did have those connections, and we didn't really follow her. Like, as I said, she was somebody that we reached out to after the election because we wanted to get another perspective from somebody who had one. So I would love to be, I think it's a really important question, super important. I just feel unable to give any insight, but thank you.
All right, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting presentation. So I'm really interested to the temple candidate, and it's really it's really vetting. And do you have any finding that show is there any like form of coercion to the women candidate that being forced to be a candidate, and in what level of election, like in the RD or that have many temple candidates for this?
I would love to have a quantitative study in terms of how many candidates are temple candidates and whether it differs, in DPRD or any of the other electoral contests. Unfortunately, that wasn't the research that we had the capacity to do. What I would say is that, yes, some of them did feel, or they certainly, well, first I should say, we didn't talk to any of the temple candidates. So we went to how we recruited people was usually to go to the party offices and to get the names of candidates. And then we would try to snowball from there out. And usually the people in the party rooms didn't want to give the names of candidates who were temple candidates. We pushed them to, no, give us all of them, blah, blah, blah. Then the candidates themselves weren't interested in talking to us. So, we had zero data from that. So I should be really upfront about it. But I do think it's super important, interesting question in terms of what percentage they are across the board. And I mean, certainly we've got secondhand, anecdotal, people were coerced or cajoled in order to be on the ballot paper. But we do also have the rumours that were circulating that some women, took money to have their name on the ballot paper. So, that's also a thing. Again, we have very flimsy evidence on that, but yeah, it's my impression, I guess. Thank you.
All right, we still have some time, so if anyone wants to ask, yeah, Sam, Ibu Sari, yeah, is there any other? Okay, just to maybe I will ask you some question, but maybe you start with this first. Okay.
So in the graph you presented at the beginning, the increase of percentage of women, it seems it's fast and it's slowed down a bit. Is that true? And if so,
yeah, that was in the national. So it had so they introduced like the soft kind of, consider women candidates in 2003, and then in the next election in 2004, it was at 12%. And then I think after that, they made it slightly stronger. And so you had that bump up to just less than 12% in 2009. And then they gave it more teeth. So, then the Election Commission started to look at party lists, I believe. And so then we had another big bump up to just below 18%. Then it actually went down. And so there was no, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there were any legislative changes between, 2014 and 2019? Am I wrong? Okay, yeah. And so there was a slight dip then, like only by half a percentage point or something.
It was strengthened. In the election before, there was a slight fall. Paradoxically, that the legislative regulatory change should intuitively result in an increase, but it didn't actually. It resulted in that very slight decrease.
Right.
It wasn't until the following election.
But it was it in 2017, yeah. 2017, because in between, yeah. No, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure I have got it wrong. Let me just see if I can find it. Oh, it's right at the beginning. Oh, it's here. Oh, yeah, second one, I think. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So yeah, it became strengthened. This is the one where it really started to get teeth in 2017. And so between 2014 and 2019, that's my reading of it, that it became stronger here, and then we had that, jump of 3%, and then it's been relatively flat after that. So yeah, I think it's pretty consistent with the strengthening of the law. But I also want to say, that so many, the quota didn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like, so many things are happening within Indonesia, and electoral systems are always changing. So, I talk about a correlation with the quota laws, but, I don't know what evidence we have on causation, if I'm honest.
In 2009, the quota became obligatory. So it was an important change in 2009. It didn't resolve.
2009, so it did go.
11 to 17, from 12 to 18, that is where the big jump is.
Yeah, I think there can be some confusion because even when we were circulating the draft amongst ourselves, there's a confusion because when the article was put out and what election it referred to or what election it came into effect. So that might be where that's okay. No longer needed.
In 2008, the civil system was effectively utilised by the introduction of the local party system.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marcus.
It was the law, but then the Constitutional Court eventually made it useless.
Yeah, thank you for that very important detail. Thanks.
All right, last question. Oh, it wasn't an important one. I just wanted to ask if there's any difference in the parties. Did you notice any difference amongst the parties in their attitudes towards the women candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our limited observations, I would say the PKS were the strongest in terms of supporting their women candidates. The PKB actually had the most women at number one, like if we're just going by number one. In terms of party support, the PDIP maybe had a little bit more party support if women were positioned relatively high. But they didn't have too many women positioned relatively high, but they did have some really strong candidates, which they invested a lot in. I did have some numbers in terms of the party, but there were some which were unusual. So I think NASDEM has been, conventionally really strong in terms of supporting women, but they didn't have much. They didn't put much support to women candidates, and they didn't have any in high positions. So. Yeah. Our sample's so small, so it's a bit hard to draw conclusions. But yeah, that's my impression again. Yeah. So much impressionistic stuff. It's so bad for academic paper.
All right, so we still have 3 minutes.
Oh,
so yeah.
May I ask, please, how did you come to choose Medan as opposed to other places? And if so, why that one? That's number one. Number two, is this study going to be a standalone article, or is it part of a broader study comparing them to other countries? And if it is with other countries, why was it Medan? Because just internally within the Indonesia context, but also within the international context.
Thank you very much. It's a great segue as well to talk about the border project. So Medan is because I've done research there in the past, and I mean, not for any really good reasons. So I started going to Medan because it was, one of the largest cities outside of Java. I didn't want to do research in Java because a lot of people do research in Java, and also because, speaking very frankly, I didn't think I'd be able to learn Javanese and be able to get those cultural nuances, much more like music, if you like, in that respect. So Medan was, and then I looked at Medan, and because of its diversity, I was also really interested in it as a city. So I did research in 2013 on an earlier project. And so then I built the relationships that I have with, Asma and Ida and Yumas. And so then we just work as a team together. So, and I've got that familiarity. I do work across different countries. So I work in India as well, and I've started to do some research in Australia. And what this makes me is, I think, I want to make sure that whatever I'm doing is as grounded as possible. And so for me to do more than one location in Indonesia, I think would make me even thinner on the ground. So I just focus on Medan because I understand that context the best in terms of Indonesia. But it is a comparative project with India more directly. So not just, this is a standalone paper. So this is a paper on gender electoral quotas, but the broader project is looking at women's political labour in India and Indonesia, with some comparative insights to Australia as well. So I've been working in India a lot longer actually, and they do have a gender electoral quota system there also, but with many, many differences, and so the comparison is not straightforward. But what the intent is to try to develop some conceptual theoretical lenses that sheds light on both of these contexts, but in very different ways, if that makes sense. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Tanya, for your very interesting presentation. See you on the next ISG, I guess. Yeah, next week then.
Can I just say a big thank you to everybody's questions and provocations and all the rest of it. As I say, like, I really appreciate this crowd in particular for getting me away from my missteps.